So what happened? People were using this term metaphysics to refer to, that philosophy that Aristotle was doing when he was talking about being as being or unchanging things, etc., right? Why all of a sudden a change in this term? Oh, I think a little history first, I think it would be interesting, history of philosophy and elucidating. First, you should know that there is philosophy of material things and that it's legitimate philosophy. So, for example, I look at a rock, right? And I happen to know, thanks to science, that rocks are made of particles, subatomic particles, ultimately, that build into atoms, and atoms that build into elements, etc., etc. Finally, we get rocks. Well, what is more real? The rock itself, the subatomic particles that make it up? Are they equally real? Are neither one of them? There are philosophies that claim any one of those options, and those are really scientific things to discover, right? We can't look at the rock. We see what it's made up of, but then we can't say, see, look, I can observe that there is actually no rock. No, you observe a rock, and you also observe, subatomic particles that make it up. Now, our question is, what is the reality of all those things? Those are philosophy of material, for material beings. But in the 17th century, a whole new type of study comes along for physical things, right? We discover that we can quantify aspects of material objects. We can describe them with mathematical equations and predict what's going to happen with them with, perfect accuracy. Really awesome. Well, the term physics in Aristotle's book referred to philosophy of physical things. But along comes this new science stuff, right? This empirical observation and testing and stuff like that. And the word physics all of a sudden gets used for that instead. I think what's interesting here is that we have this term physics that is used for both things, and obviously one wins out because it's much more practically useful, and we can get a lot more certain knowledge from it. And for those reasons, we use that word physics and we forget the philosophy of physics. But the philosophy of physics is still very important and still very interesting in all those things. I think what's going on here is that we have two different methods of studying one object. And both of them are important. Both of them complement each other in different ways. And for that reason, maybe we should have retained that term physics just for the object of study and not for the methods that we use to study that object, right? But for better or for worse, the term gets applied to the method of use when we're studying those particular objects, which is empirical observation and physical testing and using mathematical equations and stuff like that. Yeah, like I said, for better or for worse, that's what the physics means now. Though I don't think there's necessarily has to be some kind of antagonism between those two. All right, well, so physics starts to take the name of the empirical science. All of a sudden, we're left with stuff like the questions of material constitution. How do we know, what objects are made up of what? How do objects change? How does an object retain its identity through change? Those kinds of questions all of a sudden don't have a place because they were physics. They were, which we would call philosophy of material objects. That's not really a term that's being used. So where do we throw these things now? They get thrown into metaphysics, right? Because metaphysics is talking about being, right? But it's talking about being insofar as it is just being, right? Being as being. Now we're talking about things that be, and we're worried about their kind of being, but we're not worrying about them being just insofar as they be. This is terrible grammar. I realize it sounds awful, but it's really hard to get at first. But yeah, metaphysics used to be just studying being in the most general sense, and being whatever makes things real. Now all of a sudden we're looking at these other things where we're worried about the reality of these things, such as physical objects, the material constitution, other things like the existence of the mind. Do minds exist? These non-material, thoughts exist. Free will, does that exist? A non-determined type of free will, is that something that's real? And so those questions, although they aren't studies of being as such, they are studies of being in a particular way. They get all lumped together in metaphysics, for better or for worse. There was actually a philosopher named Christian Wolff that notices this and says, well, we can keep using this term this way, totally fine, because although, yes, metaphysics does mean study of being as being, there's also ways to study special metaphysics, right? Being in particular ways, like I said. And so he thinks that, you can make this word metaphysics make sense. And maybe it does, and maybe it doesn't. I think, personally, I think that the term isn't very useful when used this way. And here's why. All things exist, right? All things that we study at all exist. So really, if we're talking about studying being insofar as it be's a particular way, then we'd just be studying anything, and in any way, like if you're not referencing any kind of methodology, you're just referencing things that are real insofar, as whatever way that they're real, well then, studying surfing is studying things that exist. I don't know. So I don't know that he gets, I don't know that he captures the actual, the gist of what's going on here. But I may be wrong, For better, for worse, today when we say metaphysics, what we mean is, yes, that study of being as such, like Aristotle was doing, but we also mean a few other topics in there too, where we are worried about, are these things real or not? But then we ask other questions about them as well. So studies of things like the mind. Is the mind real? Is it one of those things that being has? And oh, by the way, in what way is it real? Is it real like, a tree is real, or is it real just like the color of my skin is real? Like what kind of real do we have there? So those are questions that are definitely related to metaphysics. Are they metaphysics or not? I don't know. But check out I have a blog post on this. Does it matter in the first place? Can we change this term metaphysics to mean this specific thing, and then throw a few extra things on top of that? In the blog, I liken that to some music genres, right? Where you will listen to, say, like let's say you like hip hop, and you also listen to Bone Thugs and Harmony, and that's like Bone Thugs and Harmony. They kind of rap, but they were doing a lot. It sounded a whole lot more like singing to me, and you might throw that under your hip-hop genre just because when you're listening to hip-hop, it's related to hip-hop, and that's kind of where you like it, right? And that's when you tend to listen to hip-hop, you tend to listen to that as well. We could look at metaphysics, that term, like that, right? There is real metaphysics, right? That studying of being as such. And then also when I'm doing that, I also, kind of close to that is the study of human minds and stuff like that, and I like to do that then. So we could do that, and we could also check out my podcast. I have a podcast on who gets to determine when a term changes its meaning. So I just explained to you how the word metaphysics has sort of changed, taken on a new meaning. Can you do that? Are philosophers today wrong when they say the word metaphysics, or do they get to use that word metaphysics however they want? Because, hey, they're the ones that are, in a community of people using that term. What do you think? Anyways, that's all I got for this Philosopher's Classroom. Adios.